Uvabasu Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. Presidents and Kings, Reis Galuta lo Maxeki Bahu. Fascinating study on power, and particularly the question of whether presidents and prime ministers today have the din of a melech. There are a lot of halachot that apply to the way we relate and engage with kings. Just understanding what is that level of power, and does current political power equate in any way to Malchus? We have the Gemara that says, Hani de Reis Galuta lo machzikuban velo mechazkinan behu. People who belong to the family of the Reis Galuta, so in the time of Babylon, in the time of Bavel, the government used to appoint a Reis Galuta, a head of the Jewish community. And he was generally somebody that was descended from Malchus Beis David. So he came from the family of kings, and there were some very great Reis Galutas, and there were some less great Reis Galutas over the period of time. But these authorities over the Jewish community in Bavel had an enormous amount of power. The principles of chazaka that we've been discussing, that possessing a field, a property, an apartment, a home for 3 years without being questioned by the original owner, constitutes proof of ownership. It certainly constitutes proof of possession, but this does not apply if the buyer or the seller comes from the family of the Reis Galuta. Then these halachas don't apply. Why? Says Rabbeinu Gershom, de bishvil kvodan shatki anshi, because if you buy if one of the members of the household of the Reis Galuta were to occupy a field of yours or an apartment of yours, they have such covet, there was such respect for those people, you wouldn't come and question it, you would just leave it, you would let it go. You wouldn't challenge a person from the home of the Reis Galuta. And if you've occupied one of their properties, that also doesn't prove possession. They're so wealthy that they wouldn't be petty about throwing you out of their property. If you've occupied their property, they would leave you to be there. The Ritva says, the Ritva takes an important step forward, halachically, and says this is not specific to the members of the household of the Reis Galuta. This is anybody who has an enormous amount of power and are connected to the government. Somebody that you wouldn't want to challenge, you would just leave it alone. It just wouldn't be worthwhile getting onto the wrong side of them. And that means, what's important about that is, that means it would apply in modern times too. It wouldn't only be for the time of the Reis Galuta, but according to the Ritva, any situation, this is not specific to the Reis Galuta, this is a general din that applies with all situations of powerful bodies. And my Rebbe, the Ra'o, says the Ritva, agreed with me that is correct. That this is not specific to the Reis Galuta, it's for anybody. The Rama, so Rama is Spain, the time of the Ramban, 12th century. The Rama says, adds a small feature and says, it depends on urchayu bahachi. If it's accepted practice that you don't challenge this particular authority, the Reis Galuta or anybody else, if that's kivan de urchayu bahachi, havelu ku'umnim varisim v'apetrupin, then we apply a different halacha. The principles of chazakah don't apply, because you can see that normal practice is you don't challenge these people. So it doesn't depend on are they from the house of Reis Galuta, nor does it depend on are they powerful politicians. What it depends in, what is the practice, what's normal in that society, that's what you would look at. But then even according to the Rama, if it's normal not to challenge people of this kind of status, then that would be the din even today. There wouldn't be chazaka in those situations where one wouldn't challenge that chazaka. What's interesting is that this halacha is left out of the Shulchan Aruch. It's completely non-existent in the Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes you've got to learn from what's written, and sometimes you've got to learn from what isn't written. And the Shulchan Aruch doesn't paskin this halacha, it just leaves it out completely. Why is that so? So the Rashba was asked a shaila. A man was digging tunnels under his neighbor's property. Sounds a bit of a Hamas guy, but he wasn't. He was a Jewish person. He was digging tunnels under his neighbor's property. His neighbor dies, and the heir of the neighbor, Shimon was the neighbor, the heir now claims, get rid of your tunnels. I don't want tunnels under my property. Says the man who dug the tunnels, but my tunnels have been there for years and your father never objected. So I've got a chazaka in that underground area. The son then says, that wasn't a chazaka. Part of the reason that, yes, you're right that you had these tunnels for several years while my father was right, but avicha ya pakid v'karov lemalchut v'haya ki ileim ve'en lo chazaka. But your father was a powerful person. He was close to the government. I would never have challenged your father, or my father would never have challenged that. This is a situation that they wouldn't have been challenged. Says the Rashba at the end of quite a long tshuva, and it's interesting. Look at the Rashba's tshuva. This is tshuva number 941. This is only Chelik Aleph. This is only his first volume. So you get an idea of how prolific the Rashba was, apart from writing on Shas, writing Toras Habayis, halachas, on his own Shulchan Aruch almost. He also wrote so many tshuvas. And he writes there that, U'mashe ta'ana viva ya pakid, eina ta'ana, and this that you said that your father was a pakid, he had a formal position with the government, that's not valid. She'ein ha'pakid bevei nesiya she'em shlitim le'olam, v'hem b'shriratam kemelech b'malchuto, aval ha'yehudi ha'pakid li'itim eino b'oto din. You can't compare a pakid, no matter how powerful he is, a bureaucrat, no matter how powerful he is, you can't compare him to a king. Because a king has no term limits. And a pakid has term limits. He's not there forever. And he knows he's not going to be there forever. And everybody else knows he's not going to be there forever. So he's not treated with anywhere near the same level of respect or even fear that somebody who has no term limits has. And certainly if there was a time when Reuven was not, during the period of Shimon's lifetime, if there was actually a time where he wasn't a pakid, then certainly this wouldn't apply. But even apart from that, the Rashba introduces this interesting idea of a term limit and says what's unique about the power of a king is that it's power with no term limit. And therefore one's very scared. This is not a person who knows he can at any day he can lose his job and then he becomes like anybody else. He has a different level of humility, a different level of caution, and people are more willing to challenge than somebody who has power for an unlimited amount of time. The Rosh was asked a similar question. The Tur brings his father's tshuva, and he's asked about Gedolim ha'olchim bechatzar ha'melech. So the Rosh is in Europe. The Reis Galuta was in Bavel. And the Rosh is asked, in our situation here in Europe, there are many Jews who are in and out of the king's palace. They're very close to the king. Do they have the din of a Reis Galuta? Are we afraid to challenge them? Im yesh ledemotan ledebei Reis Galuta li'inyan chazaka, tshuva yera'eh she'ein ledamotan vahem. Says the Rosh, no, they cannot be compared to the Reis Galuta. Shehem hayu mizera hamlucha v'hayu noagim ke'ein melucha al Yisrael, hilkach eimat malchut alehem. The Reis Galuta were descended from kings, and they ruled like kings. So the Rosh is saying something similar to the Rashba. There is a qualitative difference between a melech and a president or a prime minister or a minister in the government's office. As powerful as those positions are, it's not the same as Malchus. So what's the difference? Both the Rashba and the Rosh have given us qualitative differences in the type of power that a king has as opposed to the power that a politician has. One, according to the Rashba, time limits and term limits. And the second, according to the Rosh, is not being answerable to a higher power. That's what's unique about a melech, and that's why we talk about Malchus Shamayim, we talk about Hashem as king, and we talk about a human being as a king. Why do we even use the same concept? Because what we mean by a melech is somebody who's not answerable to a higher power. If this person, no matter how much power the king has given somebody, at the end of the day, it's still at the pleasure of the king, and the king can take that power away at any time. And that's a different level of power. The kind of power you don't challenge is power which has no term limit and power which is not answerable to a higher authority. In our world today, with probably very few exceptions, we don't have that level of power. Today, presidents and prime ministers, not only are they answerable to higher authorities, they're answerable to lower authorities. It's the people below them. That was the whole chiddush of democracy, that the president should be, or the prime minister should be answerable to the people, not only to somebody higher than them. And so certainly there wouldn't be that level of power. It gives us a sense of what it was like to be under the authority of a king. that there's no appeal, there is no higher authority to go to. He is never afraid of losing his position. His position will never, his term will never end. That's the level of a melech. And when one talks about the halachas of a melech, that's really what we mean. The questions of, do you say a bracha, for example, do you say the bracha for a king if you meet a president? Based on the way we're learning here, it would seem to be that you wouldn't, that's not the same level. He's a pakid. At the end of the day, a president is a pakid. He's a bureaucrat. He occupies an office, and he's got it for a period of time, and when the period of time is over, he's an ordinary human being like everybody else. That's not really the same. I was once flying with an Israeli ambassador was sitting next to me. We were having a lovely talk, and we were chatting. We get to the airport, to Ben Gurion, and our luggage is coming off, and he's standing next to me, and my luggage comes off first, and he takes my luggage off to help me with the luggage. And this was a long time ago. I wasn't even an old person. And I said, Mr. Ambassador, that's not the fi kvodcha, that you shouldn't be doing that. He said, here, when I come to Israel, I'm not an ambassador. Here, I'm a pakid. Here, when I go to the office, I sit in an open space office. I'm treated just like an ordinary pakid, like an ordinary bureaucrat. When I'm overseas, I'm an ambassador. Here, I'm not an ambassador. And you realize what this is. You can have all the glory, you can have all the honor, but when your period of office is over, you're back to being an ordinary human being. And you're aware of that all the time. So you don't have the same kind of power as a melech. And that's why the Rambam paskins, v'chein rashei galuyot shel oto zman. The Rambam says this din only applies to the Rashei Galuyot of that time. Now we know the Rambam paskins halachot conceptually, so it doesn't matter to him whether the halacha applies in that given state in modern times. The Rambam will paskin halachot throughout Shas, because there's a concept in the halacha, as we're seeing here. There's a concept in this, how chazakah works when you're too afraid to challenge it. That's the real principle here. Does chazakah work when an individual is afraid to challenge? But what is the basis of that fear? That's Reis Galuta. You had that in the times of Bovel. Says the Rambam, you don't have that today. So this halacha doesn't apply today, but still the Rambam paskins lefisha yaba in koach lirdot et ha'am, because in those days the Reis Galuta had power to rule over the people. And now we understand from the Rashba and from the Rosh what that means. Nowadays also there could be people who have power to rule, but it's not the same power. There's ruling and there's ruling. There's ruling with a term limit and there's ruling without a term limit. There's ruling where you're still answerable to a higher authority, and there's ruling when you're not answerable to any higher authority. And in the Jewish community we don't have that level of ruling anymore, and therefore this principle and this Gemara doesn't apply. And the Beis Yosef says, Da'at HaRambam kedat Shuvas HaRosh. I believe, says the Beis Yosef, that the Rambam holds like the Tur's father, like the Rosh. Tedafka the Reis Galuta sheyunogin shora al hatzibur. And the Isma says, and that's why the Shulchan Aruch leaves it out, because it doesn't, according to the Shulchan Aruch, like the Rambam, like the Rosh, like the Rashba, he holds that Malchus is a very unique type of power that we don't have today, that doesn't exist today. And therefore today one has and should have the courage to be able to challenge even a powerful bureaucrat, because the powerful bureaucrat knows in his own heart that his power is limited both in time and in degree of independence. But in the times when there was really a melech, that would be different. On the other hand, the Rabbeinu Gershom and the Ritvo seem to hold that this would apply in any situation where there's not only great power, but even great honor. Says the Rabbeinu Gershom, de bishvil kvodan shatki inshi. Even if let's say there's a great Rav, a great Rosh Yeshiva that nobody would challenge, where anybody would feel uncomfortable challenging, he also might not be able to establish chazakah, because we could say nobody would challenge. You've got to look, as the Ramah says, what's the normal thing? If people don't challenge him, then he's in that category. And so we see these two levels of power, but certainly in terms of how the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch paskin, there's a very big difference between royal power in those days, which was absolute, and democratic power, which is not absolute and therefore not the same degree of autocratic power.